In March 1860, the Clotilda, a two-masted schooner with a sleek hull designed for speed, departed Mobile, Alabama, under the command of Captain William Foster, a seasoned mariner with a reputation for ruthlessness. Commissioned by Timothy Meagher, a prosperous Alabama merchant, the ship was tasked with an illegal mission to procure enslaved Africans despite the U.S. ban on slave importation enacted in 1808. Welcome to the glorious historian, where the silenced voices of enslaved Africans resound through time. From brutal chains to unbroken spirits, we unveil their struggles, resilience, and legacy. Subscribe now, share your thoughts below, and journey deeper into their truth. Let their voices guide your heart. Listen on. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database documents that between 1619 and 1865, over 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, with the Clotilda representing one of the last illicit voyages, a testament to the persistent greed fueling this inhumane trade. Foster's crew consisted of 12 men, including a first mate named Johnson, a grizzled sailor with a penchant for discipline, and a young cook, barely 18, who had signed on for the promise of quick wealth. The Clotilda's hold was meticulously refitted for its grim purpose. Iron shackles, forged in Mobile's foundries, were bolted to wooden platforms, creating a claustrophobic space designed to hold up to 110 captives. Foster's log, preserved in fragments at the Alabama Historical Society, noted the ship was fitted for 110 souls, with provisions for 6 weeks. These provisions were meager: sacks of cornmeal, barrels of yams, and casks of brackish water, calculated to keep the captives alive at minimal cost. The ship's destination was Ouida, a notorious slave port in the Kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, where European and African traders collaborated in a brutal commerce. Posts from @African Archives on X describe how Dahomey's rulers, enriched by the trade, sold captives from rival tribes, Yoruba, Fon, and others, often acquired through raids or warfare. The Clotilda's transatlantic crossing was fraught with tension. British naval patrols enforcing the 1807 British abolition of the slave trade prowled the Atlantic, and Foster kept his crew on high alert, ordering night sails to evade detection. As the Clotilda neared Ouida, the crew glimpsed coastal forts, their stone walls manned by Portuguese traders and Dahomey guards. The air was thick with salt and the acrid smell of burning wood from nearby villages. On shore, enslaved Africans awaited in barracoons, cramped, filthy pens where they were held like livestock. Among them was a young Yoruba man, later known as Cudjoe Lewis, whose account in Barracoon would immortalize this journey. Captured in a raid, Cudjoe, then about 19, was bound with ropes, his village destroyed, his family lost. Foster prepared to negotiate with a Dahomey chief, unloading crates of rum, muskets, and coarse cloth as payment. The crew, hardened by the trade's brutality, checked the shackles and platforms below deck, ensuring they could secure their human cargo. The captives, mostly young and able-bodied, were selected for their strength, destined for Alabama's cotton fields. Their voices, a mix of languages and cries, drifted across the water, a haunting prelude to the horrors ahead. The Clotilda's mission, driven by profit, was about to plunge these men and women into one of history's darkest voyages. The Clotilda dropped anchor off Ouida's coast, where a sprawling slave market pulsed with activity. Enclosed by mud walls topped with thatched roofs, The market was a chaotic hub where European traders, Portuguese, British, French, and Dahomey merchants bartered for human lives. The transatlantic slave trade database records Ouidah as a primary port, exporting over 1 million Africans between the 17th and 19th centuries. Its barracoons infamous for their squalor. Captain Foster, accompanied by his first mate Johnson, waded into this grim commerce. Negotiating with a Dahomey chief adorned in colorful robes, Foster offered crates of barrels of rum, 50 muskets and bolts of coarse cloth for 110 captives. The chief, flanked by warriors with spears, inspected the goods, his authority absolute. The captives, aged 15 to 25, were from diverse tribes, Yoruba, Fon, and others, their languages a cacophony of despair. Cudjoe Lewis, in Barracoon, recalled the market's horrors. Traders prodded his muscles, checked his teeth, and branded his skin with a hot iron, marking him as property. The barracoons were suffocating pens, their air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Women clutched children, only to be torn apart as traders sorted them by strength. A young Yuet girl, no older than 10, wailed as her mother was dragged away, her cries echoing across the compound. African archives posts describe such scenes as routine, with families shattered to maximize profit. Clothing was minimal, strips of tattered cotton, offering little protection against the sun or shame. Foster's crew, hardened by years in the trade, oversaw the loading process. Captives were marched to the shore, their ankles bound with ropes, and loaded into canoes rowed by Dahomey oarsmen. The Clotilda loomed offshore, its masts stark against the horizon. Below deck, the captives were chained in pairs, forced to lie on wooden platforms barely 2 feet apart. The hold, just 5 feet high, was a claustrophobic nightmare, its air heavy with sweat and fear. Barracoon captures Cudjoe's words. The dark so thick, it choke your soul. Disease was an immediate threat. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water, and smallpox, thriving in the cramped hold, loomed over the captives. Provisions were scant. A daily handful of cornmeal and a cup of brackish water doled out by the cook, who grumbled about the waste of food. The crew ignored the captives' pleas, their focus on securing the chains and maintaining order. Yet, even in this darkness, resilience flickered. A Yoruba elder, his face etched with tribal scars, hummed a prayer, his voice steadying those nearby. A Fon woman whispered her child's name, vowing to remember. These small acts of defiance noted in the database sustained their humanity. The Clotilda's hold, though a place of horror, became a crucible where their strength was forged. The Clotilda embarked up the Middle Passage, a 6 to 8 week ordeal across the Atlantic, notorious for its brutality. The transatlantic slave trade database estimates mortality rates of 15 to 20%, with disease, starvation, and suicide claiming countless lives. The hold was a living hell. 110 captives chained in pairs lay spooned together on wooden platforms, unable to stand or turn. The air, thick with the stench of sweat, vomit, and excrement, clung to their skin, the planks beneath them slick with filth. First Mate Johnson patrolled the hold, his boots echoing above the captives' groans. The crew, fearing revolt, a constant threat noted in African archives posts, enforced discipline with whips. A young Yu man, caught whispering, was lashed, his cries silenced by fear. Cudjoe Lewis in Barracoon described how tribal songs sustained them, Yoruba and Fawn melodies blended in the darkness, a fragile defiance against their captors. Women faced additional horrors. Barracoon hints at sexual violence by crewmen, a common abuse on slave ships. A Fawn woman, her face scarred from a village raid, shielded a younger girl, whispering prayers to keep her calm. The crew's rations were meager. A handful of cornmeal mixed with rancid water, served in clay cups. Scurvy set in, causing bleeding gums and aching joints, while dysentery ravaged weakened bodies. The dead were disposed of without ceremony. Foster's log recorded, 3 gone to sea, fever took them. Corpses were tossed overboard, their bodies sinking as sharks trailed the ship. A grim reality noted in the database. The crew, indifferent, joked about the fish food, their laughter filtering into the hold. Resilience, however, endured. A Yoruba elder, his voice hoarse, led prayers, his words in an unfamiliar tongue uniting the captives. A young boy, perhaps 12, shared his cornmeal with a sick neighbor, his small act of kindness a spark of hope. Another captive, using a stolen nail, carved a tribal symbol into the wood, preserving his identity. These acts, documented in the database, were common, a testament to their unyielding spirit. The Clotilda's sails strained against the wind, pushing toward Mobile. The crew, weary but driven by profit, maintained their brutal routine. Below, the captives clung to memories of home, villages, families, freedom, their songs and stories a lifeline in the face of unimaginable suffering. 3 weeks into the Middle Passage, a violent storm engulfed the Clotilda. Waves crashed over the deck, flooding the hold with icy water that soaked the captives' tattered rags. Chains clanked as the ship pitched, their iron biting into wrists and ankles. The transatlantic slave trade database notes storms often exacerbated mortality, weakening already frail bodies. Foster's log recorded, lost 2 to fever, sea claims them, a cold tally of lives extinguished. The crew, drenched in cursing, pumped water from the hold, their efforts barely keeping the ship afloat. Johnson, wielding a whip, shouted orders, his face twisted with frustration. Below, the captives shivered, their bodies pressed closer for warmth. Despair deepened as some refused food, choosing death over the unknown horrors awaiting them. A Yoruba woman named Abila, whose story Cudjoe Lewis shared in Barracoon, emerged as a beacon. Her voice, steady despite the chaos, recounted tales of ancestral heroes, kings and warriors who defied invaders. Her stories, passed from one captive to another, kindled hope. A young Fawn man, inspired, whispered his village's name, vowing to survive. The crew, fearing mutiny, tightened the chains, leaving bruises and raw skin. African Archives posts describe such measures as standard, with crews paranoid about uprisings. A captive, caught scratching at his shackles, was lashed, his blood staining the planks. Small acts of resistance persisted. A woman wove a braid into her hair, embedding a bead from her village, a silent claim to identity. Another captive, using a splinter, etched tribal marks into the wood, a practice noted in the database as common. Water rations, now brackish and foul, intensified thirst, the clay cups barely holding enough to wet parched lips. The storm subsided after 2 days, leaving the ship battered but afloat. The captives, weakened by cold and hunger, struggled to recover. Abila's stories continued, her voice a thread connecting them to their past. The crew, exhausted, resumed their routine, indifferent to the suffering below. The Clotilda sailed on, its destination drawing closer, the captives' fate uncertain, but their spirit unbroken. By the 5th week of the Middle Passage, smallpox erupted in the Clotilda's hold, its pustules spreading panic among the 110 captives packed into the suffocating space. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database identifies disease as the primary killer on slave ships, with smallpox and dysentery claiming up to 25% of some voyages' human cargo. The hold's conditions, dark, damp, and overcrowded, with barely 2 feet between wooden platforms, were a breeding ground for infection. Captain Foster, fearing the loss of his investment, ordered the sick isolated, but the cramped quarters made separation impossible. The air grew heavier with the stench of illness, mingling with sweat and despair. Kosa, a fawn woman and healer described in Barracoon, emerged as a pillar of compassion. Despite her own hunger and fatigue, she tended to the afflicted, sharing her meager water ration and wiping fevered brows with torn strips of her cotton garment. Her hands, calloused from years of labor in her village, moved with care, offering solace where medicine was absent. Cudjoe Lewis in Barracoon recalled her selflessness. Kosa, she like a mother to us all, even when her own heart heavy. Her presence steadied the captives, a reminder of their shared humanity amidst the horror. The crew, terrified of contracting smallpox, avoided the hold, leaving Kosa and a few others to manage the dying. To cleanse the air, First Mate Johnson ordered sulfur burned, its acrid smoke choking the captives and stinging their eyes. Foster's log, preserved in fragments, recorded the grim toll: 5 lost to pox, more to follow. Corpses were tossed overboard daily, their bodies sinking into the Atlantic without ceremony, trailed by sharks, a detail corroborated by the database. The young cook, barely 18, grew pale at the sight, muttering prayers as his earlier bravado crumbled. Rations, already scarce, were slashed to stretch supplies, leaving captives skeletal. A handful of moldy cornmeal and a sip of brackish water, served in cracked clay cups, barely sustained them. Scurvy compounded their suffering, with bleeding gums and swollen joints tormenting even the strongest. A boy, no older than 12, delirious with fever, cried for his mother, his voice piercing the hold's silence. Johnson, impatient, lashed him, the whip's crack echoing and the boy's whimpers faded, a punishment the database notes as routine for perceived defiance. Disease did not discriminate, but the crew's cruelty deepened the captive's anguish. Johnson, mocking the sick, tossed spoiled grain at them, laughing as it scattered across the filthy planks. Such dehumanization, the database confirms, was standard, stripping captives of dignity. Yet, resilience persisted. A Yoruba elder, his face etched with tribal scars, led prayers, his hoarse voice rising above the ship's creaks. His words, though unfamiliar to some, wove a thread of unity, binding Yu, Fawn, and Yoruba captives in shared faith. Kosa's care extended beyond the physical. She hummed fawn lullabies, soothing a young girl whose mother had succumbed to dysentery. Her songs, soft but unwavering, carried memories of African villages, rivers, markets, and starlit nights, offering an escape from the hold's darkness. Another captive, a young Yu-man, scratched a prayer into the wood with a stolen nail, its faint lines a defiant claim to his identity. The database documents such acts as common, small rebellions against erasure. The epidemic's toll mounted, with nearly a dozen lives lost in a week. Foster, in his log, noted the financial loss, not the human cost. Pox takes profit, must preserve the rest. The crew's indifference contrasted with the captives' solidarity. A woman shared her cornmeal with a weakened neighbor, risking punishment. Another, too frail to eat, whispered her child's name, vowing to carry it to her grave. These gestures, though small, forged bonds stronger than the iron shackles. As the Clotilda sailed on, the smallpox waned, but dysentery lingered, its grip relentless. Cosa, though weakened, continued her work, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and resolve. The captives, battered by disease, clung to their rituals, prayers, songs, whispered stories, drawing strength from their cultures. The database highlights how such practices, from Yoruba oracles to Fawn ancestor worship, sustained enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. The hold, a place of suffering, became a crucible where their spirit was tested and tempered, their humanity unbroken despite the crew's efforts to crush it. After 6 grueling weeks, a sailor's cry of land pierced the Clotilda's deck, signaling the approach of Mobile Bay, Alabama. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database describes Middle Passage survivors as more dead than alive, their bodies emaciated, their spirits tested by disease and starvation. The bay's calm waters, framed by pine forests under a dusky sky, contrasted with the captives' turmoil. Captain Foster, aware of federal patrols enforcing the 1808 ban on slave importation, planned a clandestine landing, anchoring in a secluded cove to avoid detection. The crew scrubbed the deck, erasing blood and filth to conceal their illegal cargo. Captives were doused with salt water to clean them for sale, the liquid stinging their open wounds and raw skin. Cudjoe Lewis in Barracoon recalled the air, humid, heavy with the scent of pine, and the crew's mocking laughter about new masters waiting. The captives, sensing a shift, whispered among themselves, their voices a mix of dread and faint hope. Some, like a fawn man named Oluwale, scanned the deck for escape routes, his hair braided with a small charm from his village, a symbol of resistance noted in the database. Timothy Meare's agents, lanterns in hand, waited ashore, eager to profit from the human cargo. The crew prepared skiffs, their muskets loaded to quell any rebellion. Oluwale, his eyes sharp, whispered plans to a Yoruba woman named Adisa, who clutched a bead hidden in her palm, praying for strength. These acts of defiance, documented in the database, sustained their spirit amidst uncertainty. Foster's log described the bay's stillness, a deceptive calm masking the captive's fear of what lay beyond the horizon. Below deck, the hold remained a place of suffering, though quieter now. Smallpox and dysentery had claimed nearly 20 lives, their absence marked by empty shackles bolted to the planks. Cosa, weakened but alive, continued to comfort others, her fawn lullabies a faint echo in the darkness. A young ewe boy, his face gaunt from hunger, stared at the porthole's dim light, vowing to remember his village's river. A memory the database notes as common among captives to anchor their identity. The crew, relieved to near their payday, grew careless, joking as they lowered the skiffs. Their laughter grated against the captives' silence, a reminder of their powerlessness. Yet, small acts of resistance persisted. Adisa wove a pattern into her hair, embedding a tiny shell from Ouida's shore, a silent claim to her past. Another captive, a Yoruba man, scratched a tribal symbol into the wood, its lines faint but deliberate, preserving his heritage. The database highlights such acts as vital to maintaining cultural continuity despite enslavement. The captives were unshackled in groups, their wrists and ankles raw from iron, The crew prodded them toward the skiffs, their muskets glinting in the lantern light. Cudjo, his body frail but his eyes alert, stepped onto the deck, the first open air he'd breathed in weeks. Barracoon captures his disorientation, the vastness of the sky, the strange scent of the land, the weight of an unknown future. The captives, though weakened, stood together, their shared ordeal forging bonds stronger than their chains. Mir's agents, clad in wool coats, inspected the captives as they disembarked, noting their strength for the auction block. The database describes such landings as dehumanizing, with captives treated like livestock. A young girl, separated from her brother in the hold, clung to Kosa, her eyes wide with fear. Kosa whispered a fawn proverb, urging courage, her voice steady despite her own exhaustion. These moments of solidarity, noted in African archives, were lifelines in the face of despair. Foster, overseeing the transfer, calculated his profits, indifferent to the captive's suffering. His log noted, "Cargo intact, save losses, Mia her pleased." The crew, eager for their wages, hastened the process, their rough hands pushing captives into the skiffs. The bay's waters lapped gently, a stark contrast to the violence of the Middle Passage. As the skiffs glided toward shore, the captives faced a new chapter of enslavement, their resilience their only shield. The Clotilda's arrival marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another, their spirit unbroken despite the horrors endured. Under cover of night, the Clotilda's captives were unloaded into skiffs, their chains clanking in the humid Alabama air. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database describes such landings as chaotic, with captives prodded like cattle onto muddy shores. Crewmen, muskets in hand, barked orders, their faces lit by flickering lanterns. The captives, weakened by the 6-week Middle Passage, stumbled onto the skiffs, their legs unsteady after weeks of confinement in the hold's cramped darkness. Cudjo Lewis, in Barracoon, recalled the shock of the New World. Towering pines loomed against the starry sky, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and salt. The muddy shore, slick underfoot, felt alien compared to the sandy beaches of Voyage. The captives were herded into a makeshift pen, its wooden stakes driven deep into the ground, surrounded by Maher's agents. A Yoruba man named Old Wale, resisting the crew's shoves, was struck with a musket butt, collapsing silently. His defiance noted in the database as common among captives facing their new reality. Timothy Mir, clad in a wool coat despite the heat, led the inspection, his lantern casting harsh shadows across the captives' faces. He haggled over prices, sorting them by strength and health, his voice cold as he assessed their value. Families were torn apart, siblings and spouses sold to different buyers, their cries ignored by the agents. At African Archives, posts highlight such separations as standard practice, designed to maximize profit by breaking bonds. The Clotilda was set ablaze in the bay to destroy evidence of the illegal voyage, its flames flickering across the water, a detail corroborated by Alabama historical records. The pen was a scene of quiet despair. A fawn woman named Kosa, her voice hoarse from weeks of singing lullabies, hummed softly to calm a young girl clinging to her side. Her eyes, though weary, held a fierce resolve to protect those around her. A Yoruba elder, clutching a bead carved with tribal marks, recited prayers to his ancestors, his words a lifeline to his past. These acts of solidarity, documented in the database, were small but powerful rebellions against their dehumanization. Maher's agents marked the captives with chalk, assigning them to buyers across Alabama's plantations. A young Ewe girl, separated from her brother during the voyage, stared blankly as an agent pulled her away, her spirit numbed by loss. Casa reached for her, whispering a fawn proverb about endurance, but the girl was led off into the darkness. The database notes such moments as routine, with children often sold separately to increase profits. The captives' anguish was palpable, their voices muted by exhaustion and fear. The crew, their work nearly done, counted their earnings, indifferent to the suffering they'd facilitated. First Mate Johnson, his whip coiled at his side, joked about the captives' new homes, his laughter grating against the pen's silence. Foster, overseeing the transfer, updated his log. Cargo delivered, Mia her satisfied. His focus was profit, not the human cost. A mindset the database identifies as pervasive among slave traders. The agents, eager to disperse the captives before dawn, hastened the process, their lanterns bobbing as they led groups away. Despite the betrayal of their freedom, the captives clung to their cultures. Adiza, the Yoruba woman, wove a pattern into her hair, embedding a tiny shell from Ouida, a silent vow to remember her home. Another captive, a fawn man, whispered his village's name, passing it to a younger boy to keep it alive. The database emphasizes how such acts, names, symbols, rituals, preserved African identities across generations. Cudjoe, his body frail but his mind sharp, memorized the faces of those around him, vowing to carry their stories forward, a promise fulfilled in Barracoon. The captives' resilience shone through their shared suffering. A group of Yoruba men, standing together in the pen, hummed a funeral song for those lost at sea, their voices low but steady. Kosa, though separated from many she'd cared for, continued her prayers, her fawn spirituality a shield against despair. At African Archives underscores how such cultural practices, from songs to storytelling, sustained enslaved Africans through the worst of their trials. As the captives were marched off into the night, their chains rattling, they faced an uncertain future on Alabama's plantations. The pen, now empty, stood as a silent witness to their betrayal, its stake scarred by the weight of countless others before them. The Clotilda's burning wreck faded into the distance, its ashes sinking into the bay. The captives, though stripped of freedom, carried their strength within, their cultures and bonds an unbreakable armor against the horrors awaiting them. The Clotilda's captives faced their final indignity at a mobile auction held in a dusty square under Alabama's relentless sun. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database estimates 600,000 Africans were sold in the U.S., their labor fueling the cotton economy that drove global trade. Men, women, and children stood on a wooden platform, stripped to their waists to display their strength. Buyers in top hats and wool suits bid coldly, inspecting teeth and muscles as if evaluating livestock, their voices a drone of commerce. Cudjoe Lewis, renamed Cudjoe by his buyer, was sold for $800 to a planter bound for a plantation near Mobile. Barracoon captures his grief. His Yoruba name, Kosula, was a tether to his village, now severed by the auctioneer's gavel. Abila, the Yoruba woman who had sustained others with her songs, was separated from her son, a boy of 10, her cries drowned by the crowd's murmurs. Overseers, their gray coats a symbol of authority, patrolled the square, their whips coiled but ready, ensuring no captive resisted. The auction was a theater of cruelty, its brutality masked by the banality of trade. A young ewe girl sold to a merchant for $300 screamed for her mother, her eyes wild with terror as she was led away. At African Records notes, such family separations were deliberate, aimed at breaking bonds to prevent rebellion. The platform's warped planks, worn by years of use, bore the sweat and tears of countless others, a silent testament to the trade's scale. Buyers boasted of their investments, their voices loud with greed, indifferent to the captive's anguish. Yet, defiance endured. Abila, standing tall despite her chains, sang a Yoruba song of ancestral warriors, her voice soft but unyielding. Its melody, unfamiliar to the buyers, stirred the captives who hummed in solidarity, their eyes meeting in shared resolve. A fawn man, his wrists raw from shackles, whispered his clan's name to a younger captive, urging him to carry it forward. The database documents such acts as vital, preserving African identities against the erasure of enslavement. Kaza, weakened by the voyage but unbroken, was sold to a plantation for her healing skills, her hands valued, but her spirit ignored. She stood quietly, her eyes scanning the crowd, memorizing the faces of those she'd cared for in the hold. A Yoruba elder, sold nearby, clutched a bead, praying to his Orisha's deities, his faith a shield against despair. The captives' resilience, rooted in their cultures, shone through their shared suffering, a quiet rebellion against the auction's dehumanization. The economic machinery of the South depended on these sales. The database links Alabama's cotton boom to the labor of enslaved Africans, whose work generated wealth for planters, merchants, and even northern banks. Buyers, their ledgers fat with profit, haggled over prices, debating whether a prime hand warranted $1,000 or less. The captives, reduced to numbers, stood exposed, their dignity stripped, but their spirits intact, sustained by whispered prayers and fleeting glances of solidarity. As the auction progressed, the crowd's energy waned, the sun climbing higher. Overseers prodded the remaining captives, ensuring they stood straight despite their exhaustion. A boy, no older than 12, sold for $400, stared blankly. His mother's absence a wound no whip could match. Cujo, chained to a group bound for the fields, memorized the square's details, the platform's creaks, the buyers' faces, vowing to tell his story, a promise fulfilled in Barracoon decades later. The captives were marched off in groups, their chains rattling through Mobile's streets. The database describes such processions as common, with enslaved Africans driven like cattle to plantations across the South. Abila's song faded as she was led away, but its echo lingered among those who'd heard it, a spark of resistance. Kosa, her hands clasped, whispered a prayer for those she'd leave behind, her fawn spirituality unbroken. The auction's aftermath left the square empty, its dust settling as the buyers dispersed. The platform stood abandoned, its scars a reminder of the countless lives shattered there. The captives, scattered to plantations, carried their cultures, songs, languages, rituals into their new lives, their resilience a testament to their unyielding spirit. The Clotilda's voyage had delivered them to this fate, but their strength, forged in the hold's darkness, would endure, shaping their future and the legacy of African resilience. The Clotilda's captives, now enslaved, were marched to Alabama's cotton plantations, their chains heavy under the relentless sun. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database estimates 4 million enslaved African Americans by 1860. Their labor transforming cotton into a global commodity that fueled industrial wealth. Cudjoe Lewis, assigned to a plantation near Mobile, toiled from dawn to dusk, his hands bloodied by cotton bolls sharp as thorns. Barracoon describes the grueling routine. Overseers, whips in hand, lashed at any pause, their gray coats a constant threat in the fields. Life on the plantation was a relentless cycle of labor and deprivation. Food was scarce. Cornbread and molasses, often moldy, served in wooden troughs shared by dozens. Cabins with dirt floors and leaking roofs offered little shelter from Alabama's humid summers or chilly winters. Clothing was minimal, tattered cotton shifts barely covering the body, their threads worn thin by endless toil. The database notes that such conditions, malnutrition, exposure, overwork, shortened lives, with many enslaved not surviving past their 30s. Yet, resistance was woven into daily life. Cudjoe in Barracoon recounts breaking a hoe, blaming it on wear, a subtle act of sabotage that slowed the harvest. Others worked deliberately slowly, sowing seeds unevenly or misplacing tools, their defiance a silent protest against their captors. At African Records highlights Casa's resistance. As a weaver, she wove fawn symbols, spirals, and crosses representing protection, into her quilts. Her art, a hidden rebellion against erasure. Her fingers, though sore, moved with precision, preserving her culture in every stitch. Community was their lifeline. Under starlit skies, enslaved Africans gathered in secret, risking brutal punishment to share stories of their homelands. A Yoruba elder named Oluwale taught children tribal chants, his voice low to avoid detection, passing down tales of kings and oracles. Barracoon captures Cudjoe's pride in his Yoruba roots, his stories of warriors and markets vivid despite years of enslavement. Women like Abila sang lullabies in Ewe and Fawn, their melodies carrying memories of African rivers and markets, soothing children born into chains. Children, under the 1662 Virginia statute, inherited their mother's enslaved status, their futures bound to the fields. Yet, they also inherited their resilience. A boy, inspired by whispered tales of runaways, dreamed of escaping north, his eyes bright with hope in the cabin's darkness. Rumors of abolition, spread by Northern Quakers and activists, reached the plantation, their words faint but powerful. An overseer, overhearing such talk, doubled patrols, his whip cracking to instill fear, but the captives' dreams persisted. Fueled by stories of freedom, the plantation's economy was brutal, its profits tied to the captives' sweat. The database details how Alabama's cotton fields, worked by enslaved hands, supplied mills in England and the North, linking global trade to their suffering. Overseers, paid to maximize output, drove workers relentlessly, their whips leaving scars that told of their cruelty. A woman, caught resting, faced 10 lashes, her cries echoing across the fields, a punishment the database notes as routine to enforce discipline. Resistance took many forms. A woman named Adisa hid yam seeds in her hair, planting this in a secret, her small garden, a claim to the land that enslaved her. Another, caught stealing bread from the overseer's kitchen, shared her prize with a hungry child, her defiance outweighing the whip's sting. The database emphasizes these acts, sabotage, theft, cultural preservation, as common, each a spark of rebellion against dehumanization. Cudjoe in Barracoon recalled carving a Yoruba symbol into a tree, its lines a silent vow to remember his village. Spiritual practices sustained them. Cosa led fawn rituals in the woods, offering prayers to ancestors under moonlight, her voice blending with the night's hum. A Yoruba man, praying to his orishas, buried a bead as an offering, its placement hidden from prying eyes. The database notes that African spiritualities, Fon Vodun, Yoruba, Ifa, endured despite attempts to impose Christianity, their rituals a source of strength. These gatherings, though forbidden, reinforce their bonds, their shared faith a shield against despair. As seasons passed, the captives' resilience grew, their cultures a living defiance of their enslavement. Cujo, Kosa, Abila, and others carried their homelands in their hearts, their songs and stories a bridge to their past. The plantation, a place of suffering, could not extinguish their spirit, forged in the hold of the Clotilda and tempered by their unyielding will to endure. The Clotilda's survivors, including Cudjoe Lewis, built lives of extraordinary resilience despite the scars of enslavement. After the 1865 abolition of slavery via the 13th Amendment, they founded Africatown, Alabama in 1870, a community where African traditions thrived against the odds. Barracoon recounts their efforts. They cleared dense swampland, built homes from salvaged timber, and planted yams and okra, crops tied to their Yoruba and Fon roots. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database notes their labor, once stolen for cotton's wealth, now shaped their own sanctuary, though they received no reparations for centuries of exploitation. Africatown was a haven of self-determination. Cudjoe elected a leader, organized a council of elders, drawing on Yoruba governance models, his authority rooted in wisdom rather than force. He taught children Yoruba songs, his voice carrying tales of orishas and ancestral kings, ensuring their heritage endured. Kosa, now elderly, wove quilts embroidered with fawn motifs, spirals for continuity, crosses for protection, her hands steady despite years of toil. At African Records highlights their achievements, a school built with community funds, taught reading and writing, while a church, its walls adorned with African symbols, served as a spiritual center. The community faced relentless challenges, segregation and poverty, enforced by Jim Crow laws, limited resources, with Africatown's roads unpaved and its homes vulnerable to storms. Yet, resilience prevailed. A fawn farmer, trained in traditional techniques, adapted to Alabama's soil, growing crops that fed families and markets. Women like Abila, now a storyteller, shared Ewe and Yoruba tales under a communal oak, their words weaving a cultural tapestry that sustained the young. The database connects Africatown to the broader African diaspora, their practices, communal labor, oral history, mirroring those across the Americas. The Clotilda's legacy extended beyond its survivors. Their labor had fueled the U.S. economy, with Alabama's cotton exports underpinning industrial growth, yet their cultural contributions, music, art, food, shaped African American identity. Jazz, with its African rhythms and soul food, rooted in yams and greens, traced to Yoruba and Fon traditions, the database notes. Barracoon preserves Cudjoe's pride. We Africa keep, we keep our way. His words a testament to their enduring influence. The 2019 rediscovery of Clotilda's wreck, buried in Mobile Bay's mud, drew global attention, affirming Africatown's historical significance and sparking calls for preservation. Africatown was not untouched by external pressures. Land speculators encroached, buying land at low prices, while industrial pollution from nearby factories harmed crops and health. Yet, descendants fought back, organizing to protect their land, their voices echoing their ancestors' defiance. A woman trained in Fon storytelling led community meetings, her tales of resilience inspiring petitions to state officials. The database notes such advocacy as a continuation of resistance, linking past struggles to modern justice movements. The survivors' spiritual lives were vibrant, their practices a bridge to Africa. Cudjoe led Yoruba rituals, offering libations to ancestors, his voice steady under Africa Town's oaks. Kosa's fallen ceremonies, with drums crafted from local wood, honored spirits, their rhythms blending with Yoruba songs in a shared celebration. The database emphasizes how these rituals, Vodun, Ifa, endured, shaping African American spirituality despite attempts at forced conversion. The legacy lived through their descendants. A young man, taught Cudjoe's Yoruba tales, became a historian, his research amplifying Africa Town's story. Another, inspired by Kosa's quilts, created art exhibited in Mobile, her fawn symbols sparking dialogue about heritage. At African Records underscores their impact. Africa Town's advocacy influenced national conversations on reparations. Their voices a call for recognition of their ancestors' labor and suffering. The Clotilda story is one of unimaginable pain and unyielding triumph. Its captives, though stripped of freedom, preserved their cultures, songs, stories, languages, across oceans and generations. Africa Town, forged in adversity, stands as a beacon of resilience, its legacy inspiring modern fights for justice and equality. Cudjoe, Kosa, Abila's spirit endures, their community a living testament to the power of African heritage to survive, adapt, and transform. The Clotilda's voyage lays bare the depths of human cruelty and the heights of African resilience, a story that demands reflection and action. The transatlantic slave trade, per the database, displaced 12.5 million Africans, with up to 17 million impacted when including those who died in raids or captivity, per UN estimates. Their suffering built empires, cotton from U.S. fields, worked by enslaved hands, fueled industrial wealth in Europe and North America, creating a global economy rooted in their exploitation. Yet, their cultures, music, art, spirituality shaped the America's soul, their resilience a legacy that continues to inspire. At African Photos underscores their defiance, from songs in the Clotilda's hold to Africa Town's founding. They preserved their identities against relentless erasure. Cudjoe Lewis in Barracoon embodied this spirit, his Yoruba tales a bridge between continents and generations. Kosa's fawn quilts, woven with symbols of protection, and Abila's U songs, defiant on the auction block, carried Africa's heart into Alabama's fields. These acts, documented in the database, were not mere survival. They were rebellion, a refusal to let their enslavement define them. The Clotilda's story is a mirror to history's injustices. The database links its voyage to the broader slave trade, which enriched nations while impoverishing millions. Alabama's cotton, picked by Cudjoe and others, clothed the world, yet they received only chains. Their labor built universities, banks, and railroads, but their descendants faced segregation and systemic inequity. The 2019 rediscovery of the Clotilda's wreck sparked a renewed interest, with Africa Town's community advocating for its preservation as a site of memory, a call echoed by At African Photos. Today, we must honor their legacy through action. The UN's International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade, March 25th, urges education and justice. Share this story. Discuss it in schools, communities, and online platforms. Teach the names of Cudjoe, Kosa, Abila, and others, ensuring their voices endure. The database emphasizes education as key to confronting racism, a legacy of the trade that persists in modern inequalities. Subscribe to channels amplifying untold histories, amplifying the past to shape a just future. Reflection demands we ask, how can we ensure such atrocities never recur? The captive's strength, Cudjoe's pride, Kosa's care, Abila's songs offers a guide. Their shackles, now artifacts in museums, are reminders of their sacrifice, their resilience a call to dismantle systemic oppression. Africa Town's descendants continue this fight, advocating for reparations and recognition, their work a direct link to their ancestors' defiance. At African Photos highlights their efforts, from legal battles to preserve Africa Town's land, to cultural festivals celebrating Yoruba and Fon heritage. The Clotilda's legacy is not just historical, it's a living challenge. Their music, jazz, blues, spirituals, carries African rhythms, a sound of resilience born in the hold. Their food, yams, okra, rice, roots African American cuisine, a taste of home preserved through centuries. The database notes these contributions as transformative, shaping art, faith, and culture across the Americas. By celebrating them, we honor the captives' unyielding spirit, their culture's a testament to their power to create beauty amidst pain. Africa Town's story is a call to justice. Its residents face land theft and pollution, yet their advocacy persists, their voices demanding accountability. Support their efforts, donate to preservation funds, visit their community, amplify their petitions. The database connects their struggle to global movements for reparative justice, from Caribbean reparations campaigns to South African land reforms. These fights, rooted in the slave trade's legacy, demand solidarity, a commitment to equity across generations. The Clotilda's captives, though silenced by history's margins, speak through their legacy. Cudjoe's words in Barracoon, Kosa's quilts, Abila's songs, they are not relics but living sparks, urging us to act. Their resilience, forged in the darkest of trials, lights a path toward a world where such injustice is unthinkable. Let's carry their stories forward, their strength a beacon for change, their memory a pledge to build a future where all are free.